And I want to just take a few minutes to introduce some of the ideas for this evening, as well as our participants. Then I hope to step back and sort of appreciate the conversation that I know we're going to have. In the room tonight are Tom Cabarly, and raise your hand. Tom Cabarly, Mitch Prevost, and Jack Achu. They're sitting on the stage, and they're all seniors here at Williams, and you're all political economy majors, right? Yeah, okay. They are not in the room, but joining us, as you can see on the screen overhead, is Hedrick Smith, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. We're going to videotape this evening because, in part, we want to make an archive for the purposes of the college to document this winter study project, but also because I hope you will help us have a conversation about some of the issues that Tom, Jack, Mitch, and Rick Smith bring up tonight. So the recording will be shown probably on WillyNet in the next week or so. And so you should understand that when we get to the part of the evening where we invite you to join the conversation, that you should understand that you will be speaking publicly in effect. So how do we change the rules, social, ethical, to get American capitalism and government working better for all of us? In January, Tom, Mitch, and Jack spent a month considering this question by working on an initiative that we call Rules Change Project, which I've helped to guide from an office here in Williamstown. My background is journalism and tech entrepreneurship, and I've lived here in town since 1983. The Rules Change Project aims to report on and spotlight people and institutions working to change the way we regulate, govern, and do business with corporations. We seek to do solutions reporting about capitalism and the common good. We look at how the rules by which we do capitalism might be changed or interpreted differently to meet the multiple stakeholders' needs, stakeholders such as employees, suppliers, customers, communities, and in the environment, not just stockholders. The challenge, then, this challenge, is to help nudge capitalism to work better for all of us. And it's one of the themes of Rick Smith's 2012 book, Who Stole the American Dream? Since the book's publication, Smith, who's a Williams College alum and former trustee, has been crisscrossing America, speaking at dozens of colleges and universities. He's found a deep reservoir of ordinary people eager to help fix the system's weaknesses. But they often say they don't know how or where to start. So tonight, we want you all to help tell us where the Rules Change Project should be looking for leads and what Rick Smith should be advising when audiences ask him where to start. Rick has an extraordinary background for considering these issues. After a full career as a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, Rick switched to producing books and acclaimed documentaries for public television. His career spans coverage of civil rights marches in the South to trying to understand Kremlin politics from Moscow to now trying to find out what went wrong to create America's epidemic of economic inequality and consider how it might be cured. You can learn about Rick's remarkable career at hwwricksmith.org, and I'll give you that link right now. And Rick is joining us actually from his home it's Bethesda, I think, Bethesda, Maryland. And the five of us, Tom, Mitch, Jack, Rick, and I, are now had a really good phone conversation a couple weeks ago about these issues, so this is somewhat of a replay and hopefully better. So what we're going to do is, over the next 90 minutes or so, Rick's going to talk for 25 minutes or so, briefly about his book. And by the way, you can purchase a signed copy after the program in the lobby, courtesy of Water Street Books. Thank you, Richard. And also by looking at his website, Restoring the American Dream, which is going to be going live, I guess, in another month or so. But what you see right now on the right screen there is hedricksmith.com, his current homepage. So while they're talking, I'd like you in the audience to be preparing to join the conversation by coming to the microphone, which will be down here, after Rick talks and the three of them talk a little bit about their experience in January. And I'd like you to think about two questions. The first question is, what does the American dream mean to you? And how will you achieve it? And second, how do we maintain an economic system that makes it available to all? Second, What does making a difference mean to you in your life? What can Congress and corporations do to make it easier for you to make a difference? And what can we do in our communities and workplaces together? Before we turn over the floor to Rick, I do want to thank both George Mason University, which has managed a grant that I have from the F.B. Heron Foundation to work on this project. And also thanks to Paula Constellini and to her colleague, Colin Avitsky, who helped organize this evening. So, Rick, I'm going to ask you to take the floor now and give us kind of a backgrounder on how we're going to restore the American dream.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill. First of all, it's great to be at Williams, even though I'm here and you're there. I'm here in spirit with you. And I'm glad to be talking at Williams tonight because next month I'm going to be talking at Amherst. So I got to get the Williams talk in first for sure. The other day with Jack and Tom and Rich. And one of the points to me that I thought was important to them is that as seniors, having finished a great education at Williams in political economy and headed for careers on Wall Street or in industry or whatever, it's pretty easy to get, we're talking about tonight, are academic. They were part of the course, we had to take them to get our degrees. Yeah, it was good to major in political science, but now let's get on to the real world. The first point I would make to you all tonight is that what we're talking about is your lives, particularly if you're students coming out of Williams and you're young, but no matter what age you are, we're talking about life today. This is not an academic subject. People are deeply affected and deeply offended at the moment, all across this country, by the state of politics in America and the state of the American economy. We keep sending messages to Washington and saying, change things. And by change, we don't mean just change the faces of the party labels. We mean change the system so it works better. Change the political system so it's not stuck in gridlock. And actually get down to work and make something happen. And the problem is that over the last 30 or 40 years, certainly since I came out of Williams, and Bill came out of Williams, we've really become two Americans. We're divided by money, we're divided by power. What Wall Street wants and what Main Street wants are very different from Washington. What the 1% wants and what the 99% want is very different. And so getting to an agenda where the two sides can get together, quite different from the way it was before under either Eisenhower, the Republican, or Kennedy and Johnson, the Democrats, in terms of the way politics used to work, bipartisanship used to work. And today, I think people, when I think of Washington, I talk to people about Washington out around the country. And Bill, I don't live in Maryland, I actually live about a mile and a half from the White House, so I'm right at the heart of it all. People are reminded, or I'm reminded of that old Peanut cartoon. He has set up a card table in the backyard, and it says cigar through 1 cent. And you know who walks up? It's Charlie Brown. He puts his penny down, and she's, before I can give you, think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Some people take the deck chairs up to the front, to the bow, and see where they're going in the future. And other people, and see where they've been, which group you belong to. Charlie thought for a moment, I said, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded. And we chuckle at that, and that's our picture of Washington. But we're not really laughing. We're angry. And a lot of us have pretty much given up on it. People are cynical, they're hopeless, feel powerless. But what's interesting to me as I travel around is that in fact there is a lot of change that's going on that is not being well noticed and certainly not being well reported in the media. Not very far from you up in New Hampshire, I spent last winter and spring making talks up there, and there were people in the small towns of New Hampshire, Portsmouth and Nashville, and Nashville's not so small, but lots of other towns, were passing around petitions calling for a constitutional amendment to roll back the Supreme all the limits on corporate and union spending from upset about that. They don't like the flood of money flowing into American politics. So they were passing these petitions around, and in the end, 54 New Hampshire towns passed resolutions calling for a constitution for women, and literally today and yesterday in the and 16 states have already passed resolutions, written letters, actually passed referendums, statewide referendums, calling for a constitution for women. That's a major change that people are talking about. I was out in SeaTac, in the town that surrounds the airport in Seattle, Tacoma. A little town, 20, 25,000 people, mostly immigrants, people from Somalia, Ethiopia, Bosnia, Russia, Ukraine, some traditional old Americans who've been here. First town in America, the first city in America, through a popular vote to pass a $15 minimum wage. Now that's happened in Seattle, it just happened the other day, you may not know about it, it just happened in Portland, Oregon, lots of other places, and now 28 states that have a higher minimum wage than the federal government does. So things are happening at the state level. Since last summer, there was a major fight over, which is the kind of capitalism that I have in America. You may or may not recall a fight over market basket, fight in the family, and the Mullis family that set it up. One branch of the family wanted to take a lot of money out of the business, which is now 71 supermarkets all over Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, and make more money for themselves. When the guy was running it, RDT, the Mullis, he was giving more money, doing profit sharing with the workers. 15% of the profits were going to the workers. Paying the workers well, giving cash rebates to customers, operating with what has been known historically as stakeholder capitalism or inclusive capitalism. Very different from the dominant model today, certainly very different from companies like Walmart. And by the way, the prices are actually lower than those at Walmart. They're still paying profit sharing and they're still paying pretty good dividends to their shareholders. So there's another movement going on over political reform. So those things are happening. But the question that Bill raised, and I think a lot of people feel, is how do we begin? Isn't it hopeless? People are deeply disillusioned with the political system. I saw one poll that showed 91% said the political system was broken, that money had flooded, the system had corrupted our democracy, and there's kind of no getting it back. 70% or more say the economy is rigged or tilted on behalf of the 1% or the wealthy or the big corporations, and they're despairing of that. And there are other, of course, the political parties and the president get low ratings. We in the press, Bill, you connected yourself with the media just a moment ago. Of course, I spent all these years with the New York Times and working for public television. We in the media, we get terribly low ratings. The church gets low ratings. But what's important is that the American system gets low ratings. One said 60%, another one said 63% of the American public believe America is in decline. Now that's a huge judgment. We've seen our best days. The chances are the next generation is not going to live as well as this generation, maybe worse. And if you're just coming out of wins like Tom and Jack and Mitch will be next June, it's a hell of a prospect to look at. That the majority of your countrymen think that, and women, think that the country is on a downward slide as you start to launch your career. You may be able to find your own way. Context isn't good. Maybe there's something we ought to be doing about it. My theory as a journalist is we're not going to be able to do anything very much about it unless we understand how we got here. You can't get out of the ditch until you understand how the ox and the wagon got stuck in the ditch in the first place. And the common explanation, it may well be the explanation that you all have heard in your political economy courses at Williams. I hope you've heard something better than this. But you've certainly heard this line. Basically, it's globalization. It's technology. It's the advance of progress. The American middle class is in a mess. The American economy's gotten divided. We've become two nations, the 1% and the 99%, which is a bit of an hit. happened because of progress in technology. That's one of those truths that's very seductive because it is partly true. It's a half-truth. That certainly had an impact on lots of companies and lots of industries. But it's a half-truth that's dangerous. If it were the real truth, we'd see America mimicked in a lot of other countries. Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they'd all look like us, the same degree of inequality, the same kind of political gridlock and so forth. But we don't see that. We don't. It's actually had better growth than we have. We see Scandinavia, New Zealand, Australia, it's easier to go up the line there than it is in America. We used to be the one of our, we don't want that anymore. The roles have kind of reversed. We used to sit back 30 years ago and kind of mock the old European economies as vast into privilege and inequality and so forth. We were the democratic, small d, democratic country with the more classical society. Well, maybe it wasn't equality. Of course, we had poverty. Of course, we had ups and downs in our economy. But by and large, we were getting along better together. There was more shared prosperity. It's just the opposite today. So something is going wrong, and it's something that's happened inside of America that is different from what's happened in other capitalist countries in the world. That idea began to dawn on me as I was writing this American Dream. And as I write, it's sort of remembering that we used to have shared prosperity. Was there, in fact, an American dream at some point? Is there an American dream you can really point to? And I think the answer, as I look back into history, is yes, there was. If you go back to we had much more widely shared prosperity. If you look at that long period, from the mid-40s up through the mid-70s, the productivity of the American workforce, the engine that drives higher living standards, rose about 97%, almost double. Phenomenal achievement. And the pay of the average worker rate in the middle of American society went up 95%. 97%, 95%, dollar for dollar, growth, efficiency, profits in the American economy were being passed through to the people in the middle. Economists like to slice us up in quintiles, top 20%, second 20%, all the way down to the bottom 20%. All 5 quintiles over that long 3-decade period moved up together. The incomes of each group parallel to each other. In fact, the ones at the top grew a little bit less fast than the ones at the bottom. So we had what economists call the Great Convergence. Not equality. CEO of General Motors made 35, 40 times what an average worker made. But they were within shouting distance of each other. So those are the facts. How did America achieve that? And what can we learn from that America about today's America? Well, 2 things are important, it turns out. One is ideas, and the other is power. The idea that was important was that shared prosperity, business, and smart economics. Henry Ford was the guy who actually articulated the idea first, and he did it a century ago in 1914 when Ford Motor Company brought out the Model T car. Henry Ford decided to double the pay of his workers to $5 a day. It'd be about $120 a day today. Right? $5 a day. And he did. He was losing the competitors. And not only because it was fair. What Ford said, if I pay my workers better, they're going to be able to afford to buy the Model T cars that we're producing at Ford Motor. If you fast forward to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and you read what was said by Charlie Wilson, who was the CEO of General Motors, or Ray Jones, who was the CEO, Abrams, who was the CEO of Exxon, or William Remington was the CEO of Coca-Cola. What they said was, our job as CEOs is to balance the economic interests of the stakeholders in the corporation. And by stakeholder, who had a stake in the success of the corporation. Well, obviously that includes the shareholders. It also includes the banks that loan the money. It includes the customers who buy their products, who want to have their products serviced, their cars or their cell phones or whatever serviced after they buy them. It includes the rank and file employees. It includes the communities in which they have plants or have offices. So there are a lot of stakeholders out there, and the CEO is sitting not on the top of a pyramid, but kind of in the center of a wheel with the spokes going out to the various different stakeholders. That's how they saw it. And you actually had them say, it is our moral obligation, it is our balance of interest. And I can read you quotes if you want, or you can read them in my book. That's what those guys actually said. So what they did was they put that into practice. And why did it work? If you pay tens of millions of average American workers, middle, you name it, if you pay them good wages, they don't save a lot of money beyond buying a house, even for their kids' education. They spend it. Spending, that consumer demand, is what drives the economy. As I learned at Williams Economics 101, 70% of growth, 70% of what moves the economy is consumer demand. Only a minority is investment and government spending. Okay? So high wages mean high growth. The economists call that. High wages, get high demand, get high growth, expand production, hire more workers, pay them well, and the circle keeps on. That was the secret of America's growth over that long period. And the second thing, Matt, I said, was power. And this is important for us today. Power. We had the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, they were pushing for more rights for blacks, right to vote, right to use public transportation, going to hotels, ride buses, sitting drinking counters and so forth, get better jobs. But there was a women's movement. They for down feminists, women getting 41 cents on the dollar for doing the same work as men. So they pushed for more. Today it's up to about 80 cents on the dollar. Better. We now have about 100 women in Congress. They will make a company. Still not equal, but tremendous change thanks to a movement that came from below. A movement that came from below, like the civil rights movement. Had a consumer movement then. A guy named Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. Said Detroit automakers were producing cars with mechanical defects that were causing accidents, that were maiming and killing people. Sound familiar? Last year because of mechanical defects. And General Motors is paying damages today, right now, to people whose lives were lost, whose relatives were lost, or people who were maimed. So that problem persists. But there was something done about it. And there was a Consumer Product Safety Commission that was set up. There was a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Food and Drug Administration stepped up in drugs. I also stepped up inspection of meat and poultry and so forth. We lived a safer, more transparent life in our economy as a result of a citizens' movement. Strong labor movement. We had strong environmental movement. We had labor movement bargained with the big corporations so that they would share more of their profits and more of their gains and more of their growth with average workers. And that actually led to what some people call the American dream of that era. Steady wages, rising slightly over the life of the contract, rising significantly over the life of your lifetime. Good health benefits, good retirement benefit. Enough pay to be able to put down a down payment, buy, retire with some job security, and even very important, the ability to hope that your kids would live a better life than you. So that's it. That's that middle class dream that people ask about. Was there a dream? Yes. 80% of the people who worked for companies with more than 100 employees in 1980, 84%, had full retirement benefits. 70 employer-paid health insurance. Now, this was a time when people had economic security underneath them, and it was part of the social and economic fabric of the country. And that was partly because of the leaders believing that was smart business, and was partly because of the push from below. Push from below also meant that is citizen action, grassroots citizen action, mass movements also meant that the tax system was set up so the tax rates were high on the top people Under Eisenhower, the Republican president through most of the 1950s, 92%. We're told today if the tax rate was 92%, no one would work. People were working plenty hard at that with those tax rates back then. 92%. Democrat dropped down to 77%. Interesting is the growth rate of the American economy in that whole 2-decade period of the 50s and 60s averaged 1% a year. Ups and downs, of course, but averaged 3.1% a year. And if you fast forward to the last step, look at George Bush and Democrat Barack Obama. Maximum tax rate was 35%, and the average annual growth rate was 1%. And that's even before the financial downturn of 2008. So high tax rates did not slow down growth, and lower tax rates did not speed up growth. There's no connection, despite what even some other people do. The record shows there's none. On individual. The point here is to point out that the pressure from below had a direct impact on government policy, and the beliefs of the management class, the leadership class in our economy, had a direct effect on sharing the wealth. That's how we got the middle class economy that was the envy of the world in that long period. So what happened? Two things happened. We want to get to something modern, but something like that kind of sharing, then we're going to have to change ideas and power, because ideas and power change. What happens in the idea realm is that stakeholder capitalism, the idea enunciated by the Chicago economist Milton Friedman that the only mission of the CEO is to maximize return to shareholders. Give them the highest dividends, buy back your stock so your stock price goes up on Wall Street so they can make capital gains. Give much of all of it as you can to the shareholders. And what's interesting, that actually happened. That idea got taught out of American business schools. It got adopted by lots of business leaders. And there's an economic study that came out just in the last 3 or 4 months in the Harvard Business Review in September. Back in the heyday of the middle class, companies were splitting their profits roughly 50-50 between giving the return to the shareholders and reinvesting in their own growth areas geographically, buying up companies, research and development for new products, developing new products, retraining their workforce so they could handle the new technology, raising their pay, investing in the future of the company, roughly 50%, and about 50% went to shareholders. The guy did a study of the major American corporations in the Standard & Poor's 500 in the last decade, 2002 to 2013. They spent 91% of their profits in giving back to shareholders and 9% growth. If you want to know why the economy is growing slowly, that is one major reason. Companies are not, American companies, the best and the biggest American companies, are not investing in their own growth anywhere near as much as they used to. They're extracting wealth from their companies rather than using them to create more wealth and more value. And a lot of it's moving overseas. The other thing that happened was a shift in power. The business elite decided to get mobilized. A guy named Lewis Powell, who was a famous corporate attorney, wrote a memo which was circulated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and said, hey guys, you're getting killed in the political arena. Ralph Nader and the consumer movement, Betty Friedan and the women's movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, civil rights movement, they're all hemming business in. You're not making the profits you could. You need to go fight in the political arena, take back power, take the high ground, get organized, invest money in politics, and they've invested heavily in politics. It starts in the 1970s. Slowly the power equation changed to the point now where special interests, financial interests have captured Wall Street, that have captured Washington. If you expenditures and go back to the earlier period, the amount of money spent on lobbying by labor movement and business 60s and 70s. Maybe one spent twice as much one year and the other next year. Consumers were a little bit behind, but they were roughly all in the same volume. A recent study that I read showed that business interests spent on lobbying in Washington, listen to the number, 60%, 60 times as much as labor interests, and more than 100 times as much as consumer interests. There's been an enormous shift in that power. And much the same has happened in the financing of American campaigns. And the result has been that over the last 3 or 4 decades, policy has been tilted very heavily in favor of the economic elite in America. And, it comes close to home in Williams. A lot of us come from families that are very well off. Some come from families that are extremely well off. About how this is working for the country as a whole. From 1975 to about 2010, 2011, the productivity of the American workforce and the median hourly pay went up 10%. Remember, before the numbers were 97 and 95. More recently, 1979 to 2011, this is a number to remember, 84% of the entire growth in national income went to the top 1%. 84%. Which means 16% was left for the other 99% of the people. In other words, the top 1% over that came out with 5 times as much of the growth from the whole country as the entire other 99%. Now, when I first heard the slogan, 99% and 1%, I thought it was an exaggeration. I thought somebody, they're on to something, there's a huge change, there's a huge difference, there's a huge wealth gap. But they, 99%, 1%, not true. And then I came across these figures, produced and put together by a University of California economist named Emmanuel Saez and reported and analyzed by a Princeton economist named Alan Kruger. So these are hard numbers that are coming up. This is where we are. This is why people are upset. And that money is now pouring into the American political system. People are terribly frustrated by the negative advertising, by the sense that individual donors can determine the outcome of Senate elections. And now, as we watch the 2016 presidential campaign unfold, what happens? The candidates go first to the money primary. Before the voters ever get a chance to vote, the candidates look at them now in the Republican Party, and Hillary Clinton's been doing it privately on the Democratic side. They go to the wealthiest people in America and say, will you back my candidacy? Because if I can't get a billionaire behind me, or a couple of them, I can't run. Campaigns have gotten so expensive that unless I have the Koch brothers, or Sheldon Adelson, or George Soros, or somebody else of that ilk behind me, I can't run. Think about what that's saying. We now have in American politics a pre-primary determined by people of wealth. I don't think that's what the Founding Fathers had in mind. And I don't think most people think that. So is there anything we can do about it? Is this just inevitable? And I think we get to a point made by a friend of mine, Ernie Cortez, who's one of the best grassroots political organizers I've ever met. He's a Latino from Texas, operates in the Southwest. He said to me at one point, Rick, power corrupts. Remember Lord Acton said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said, powerlessness also corrupts. Powerlessness corrupts democracy at the core. If we don't think we have the power to change things, we don't have the power. We're disenfranchising ourselves. So we've got a lot to overcome, but we've got to get organized. There are all kinds of things we can do. One of the things we can do is what people did with that market basket story. We can fight for and support stakeholder inclusive capitalists like Artie Teagan, who was the guy who ran Market Basket. There is a difference today between the way Costco is run and the way Walmart is run. Costco pays better wages, pays better benefits, has less turnover, treats its employees better. It was founded by a guy named Sal Walton, whose nickname was Mr. Cheap. It pays low wages, low benefits, has high turnover. In fact, many poverty programs like food stamps and Medicaid. We can decide with our consumer dollars where we want to spend. We can push Congress to change corporate tax laws so people don't get enormous loopholes by moving jobs and production and factories overseas. We can do something about student debt. Student debt today in America is $1.2 trillion and rising at $100 billion a year. There's some state that have begun to say we can't continue with the tuition increases. And the tuition increases are happening for a couple of reasons. Inflation is costing more. Education is costing more. Inflation. But a lot of the reason is legislatures and governors are cutting back budgets. And they're not funding public education in the percentage that the public used to pay. We used to believe that investing in the future, investing in the education of our college students nationwide was a smart investment. It would make our whole country more competitive. We've shifted away from that idea, and it's everybody for themselves. And we have for-profit colleges and universities that are set up that are debt machines, simply generating enormous amounts of debt, promising people courses that will lead them to good careers, but they have low graduation rates and high dropout rates. They're simply like that. So there are things we can do in that field. There are a whole slew of areas where we can do things. We can talk about them tonight if you want. But we've got to fix the political system first. It's issue one. If we don't get a political system that is more responsive to the influence and power of political money, we're going to have a chance to deal with the major issues. We can't get past the gridlock in Congress to deal with immigration, to deal with climate change, to deal with the national debt, to deal with student debt, to deal with any of the major issues that confront our country unless we fix the political system. We got to fix gerrymandering, because we got roughly 90% of the districts in the House of Representatives are locked up. In Massachusetts, the Democrats are doing it. In Connecticut and Massachusetts, Republicans get about a third of the vote. There's 15 seats in Congress from those two states. The Republicans get 0 seats. It's the opposite in Pennsylvania and Texas and Michigan and North Carolina, where Republicans do the gerrymandering. It's distorting our elections. It's leading to gridlock in Congress because the political parties are getting more and more extreme. Money, we got to do something about constitutional limit. We got to do it. In the state of Connecticut, the state of Maine, they have public funding of campaigns. And what they have is they have campaigns that focus much more on the issues. Candidates have less time raising money and a lot more time talking to voters about the issues. And when they get in office, they're much less subject to the pressures of lobbyists. So we need to think about that as an option. There are all kinds of things we can do. But none is going to happen unless those of us who are here together tonight, and every time we get together to talk about these issues, decide we have to do something about it. We have to change the pronoun in our discussion of political and economic reform. Fix it. Meaning Washington, meaning somebody else, not us. Unless we decide to do it, nothing's going to happen. We have to take it on ourselves. So I guess my message tonight, small crowd, but good energy. Let's do something about it. Now, I want to hear what Tom and Jack and Mitch picked up in rules change, because I know Bill Densmore, and Bill certainly talked to them about some of these ideas. So where do we go, guys, that you realize that your future, your country as well as ours?
Senior political economy major.
Just mic up, so that here's
sure. Trying to do something in here. Senior political economy major, leadership studies minor from Long Valley, New Jersey. Next year I'll be working at general contracting firm Summit Construction in Boston, and also on the Boston 2024 Olympic Committee, which I'm really looking forward to. I got involved with rules change this year. One of the requirements for a political economy major is to obtain an experiential education credit, which is working with an internship or an organization that has influence on public policy. So I was really fortunate to be in contact with Dr. Consolini, who's the head of the Center for Learning and Action, who put me in touch with Bill Densmore, who is the founder and leader of the Rules Change Project. So at first I really didn't know what to expect. We were learning and talking about all of these issues in a real academic setting in our contemporary problems of political economy class, our senior seminar this fall. But I think that one of the things that I definitely realized right away with working in Rules Change was that, like you said earlier, Rick, that this is a very, very real thing. This is not academic in any sense. So I think it's important to recognize that this isn't just an academic study of what's going on in our country, but is the reality of the problems and the shortcomings that we have. So we need to address that as something that we need to take on together. There really needs to be an intergenerational conversation. So that's why I'm a little surprised there aren't more students here, because I thought that we framed this not as an academic report on the progress of the U.S., but a mere reality that there is a problem that we're facing and it needs to be addressed. I mean, Hedrick talked a lot about campaign financing and Citizens United, and I agree that, I think, off the top of my head, I think in the midterm election in 2014, there was something like $4 billion spent on the midterm elections, not even a general election, which, kind of puts into perspective how much money is spent, especially on a general election. And I think one of the main purposes of rules change is on a grassroots level, we've realized the difficulties in trying to change the way politics are run and the way corporations can influence politics. But I think that it's promising what you mentioned, Rick, that however 40 plus states have put forward referendums to try and change and limit campaign spending. And I think that's promising to show that people on a grassroots level can make a difference. And I think that people are often timid and think that they're merely cogs of the system and their voice really doesn't carry that much weight. But if people are really passionate about these issues and there is a conversation across generations, there can be meaningful change that's enacted. So for rules change, we were looking at different organizations, grassroots, different people, different corporations that were really making an effort to have more accountability for the way that their corporations or institution was run, and really look after the different employees and shareholders and how it affects the community in order to try to improve some of the deficiencies of our system. And I think that was a really rewarding experience. Working with Bill on a day-to-day basis, was so passionate about these issues, and is so well connected and respected in the journalism world, and not even just journalism. So we were able to have a lot of fruitful conversations with a lot of your allies, a lot of people that are passionate about these issues. And I think one of the main things that they harped was that how important it was for people of our age to get involved and to be passionate about this. Like I said, we're entering the real world. This isn't just me studying for a winter study internship, what's going on. This is kind of the world, the nation that we're entering into after we leave here. So I think that it's really important that we take these things to heart and be able to have an open conversation to try and increase accountability and make some meaningful, lasting change over time.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, I'm Jack Achu. I'm also a senior political economy major, so I won't repeat what he said about that. But I'm from a town called New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a suburb of New York. Like Rick said, it's a very well-off town. There's a great public school system. Everyone's expected to go to college, and a lot of them elite schools. So coming from a place like that, it's easy to be sheltered and not realize that someone has in fact stolen the American dream. And so coming from that, coming to a place like Williams is another elite institution. It's very easy to be kind of sheltered from these problems and just stay on your track and try and be on the right side of the 199% split. But in my academic development, I came to school kind of thinking political science, maybe be a lawyer. Decided that wasn't the way to go, and then I looked at my options. I said, okay, not going to be a lawyer. Should I be a doctor? I don't like science, so I better do some econ. This is a liberal arts school. I'll do some econ classes, and I liked what I learned there. But for me, I didn't really like all the math or the supply and demand charts. But I liked the ideas. I liked all the policy focus of it. So the political economy major, if you're not aware, is basically a public policy major. So the main classes we're taking this semester are contemporary problems of political economy, which is really great because that's basically what rules change is. They're the contemporary problems in our economy. So they're very much in line with each other. And I began to, you look at all these problems and you realize it's an all-encompassing systemic issue. It's not just inequality, it's not just unemployment, it's not just education, it's not just healthcare. It's all these things are completely interrelated. And so when I first came to rules change, we started really the bulk of our work was doing populating the website, doing blog posts and doing research. And in that, it kind of pushed back against what I've learned in political economy because it's so policy focused. You think that's the only way to get things done. It's in Congress or it's not going to happen no matter what. So it's easier to look at these problems and kind of throw your hands up and just say, well, our political system is too fragmented and things aren't going to get done. But looking into doing research for all these blog posts, you find a lot of people and corporations who really push back against that. There are just a few examples of posts I wrote. There was one about, everyone knows, like Panera Bread, the restaurant. You would never know that they have great corporate responsibility, and they have a branch of the restaurants called Panera Cares, where there's no cash registers, you pay whatever you can when you get to the door, and it's done a lot to stop food insecurity in those areas. Patagonia, another really popular brand on this campus, their founder runs his corporation really responsibly, donates 1% of annual sales each year to grassroots environmental organizations. And because of the environmental impact that he's aware his company has, he actually took out an ad in the New York Times, which probably many of you heard about, which was a full-page ad that said, "Do not buy this jacket." And it was a Patagonia jacket, and just said how wasteful it was, and only buy if you need it. So learning about things like that, which are not political, systemic solutions, was really eye-opening. And leaving and going into the professional world, it's really gonna, I think, shape how I feel about what I can do to kind of curb the problem. Knowing that an individual's behavior can actually have a larger impact is one of the biggest takeaways I learned at Rules Change. It could be anything. Like we learned about employee-owned firms, cooperative firms, just a whole array of solutions that I never would have thought of. But it's clear that there's a problem in our system and it needs to be fixed. The American dream is gone for a lot of people. But it doesn't have to be. Me and Tom are currently working on for the completion of our major, a semester-long project on education, proposing an education policy proposal. And through that research, the stats on social mobility, it's just non-existent. The chances a student has in a low-income environment of getting to a place like Williams is so low that there's really not a lot of hope for those kids. So, all this stuff is really it's emboldened me to really want to take action. I didn't come to this with an activist mindset whatsoever, but it's clear that this is a problem and that it's not going to solve itself. And Rules Change was really instrumental in teaching me that.
Yeah, so my name is Mitch Bravo. I was started similarly sort of sheltered like Jack. I went to a ski academy in Eastbrook, Vermont, which had about 60, 70 kids and didn't receive grades. Instead, we had written evaluations. So it was really nice in terms of the level of academic freedom. And while I was there, I got really interested in the financial crisis as it was unfolding and trying to understand what was happening as I was very separated from it. And so I carried along those interests here at school at Williams, where I've been. I was an American Studies major, which sort of explores the different levels of inequality, cultural, racial, and things like that. But then I eventually settled on the political economy major. And while I've been here, I've been interested in sort of pursuing those ideas and understanding how we can really improve our nation, and that's why I joined Rules Change as well. And so that's been a phenomenal opportunity for me to be able to combine some of my own personal and academic interests with a real job. which was really great. And so one of the things that I was doing was writing book reviews in addition to some of the blog posts, and one of the ones that was most, that had a great impact on me was a book called Coming Up Short by Jessica Silva, which is about how the sort of hallmarks of transitioning into adulthood today have sort of been eroded or compromised, meaning that rather than looking to college as a sort of guaranteed way to move up the socioeconomic ladder, it's now oftentimes leads to a debt trap, as Rick was talking about earlier, and in even other ways too. For example, marriage. If you're financially insecure, marriage you might not be prepared, and therefore that marriage it might be something that you continue to delay and delay and delay. And especially if you were your parent was a single mother, this could have serious intergenerational harms incurred onto you. And so that book, I wrote that for the Rules Change project, and I thought it was a useful sort of contribution. And I think it's difficult sometimes to have access to those sort of mainstream books, but I think putting them out there and trying to just talk about them a little bit is really a nice way to sort of change the conversation away from the sort of like sterile academic conversations. And the other main focus I had at Rules Change was about corporate governance. And so I read a couple of books. One of them is right here, actually, called Citizens Disunited. It's about basically how corporate power has grown, and managers and CEOs are so insulated from the will of the stakeholders that they're basically able to get away with anything they want. And so the author, Robert Monks, basically says that CEO pay is sort of the smoking gun of our capitalist system gone wrong. And so he proposes a bunch of different things to help make the managers of these companies more accountable to all of society. And one of the ways that he proposes doing that is trying to shed more light on political contributions, on the level of shareholder power within corporations, and generally just trying to bring corporate activity into the public limelight, because it has such a dramatic effect on all of our lives. And so it was great for me. The sort of defining experience that I had at Rules Change was the ability to just focus on things that I had already been interested in, but to do so in sort of a more real, applied way, where we were actually talking to people who were trying to carry out these ideas in the real world rather than just read paper about it and then forget about it. So that was really rewarding for me.
Thanks, guys. So what we thought we'd do now is Rick and I are going to chat with you guys for a few minutes, and then we'd like to open it up to the audience. What I want to ask each of you is really a two-part question. One is, did anything occur to you as a result of this experience about ways that you might, once you get into the business worlds that you're moving to in June, that you can either be a better change agent, or another way of looking at that question is, what should we be doing as a culture, as a society, to make it easier for people starting out in business to maintain a sense of stakeholder capitalism rather than getting caught in the trap of shareholder capitalism? In other words, what can we be doing to make it easier for you to do the right thing and to see that your organizations do the right thing?
So I'll answer the first part of that question you're asking. So I'm going into general contracting, asking me what can I do to improve sustainability and better the way. I would say they have this LEED certification for buildings, leadership, and energy and environmental design, which is all about giving credits to having sustainable materials and building expenses, only getting raw materials from a certain radius within the site and recycling everything on site. So I would say that moving forward into like a large, commercial, education, healthcare, construction management firm to try and implement some of these LEED policies to make these buildings more sustainable and make them more, living buildings so they're contributing less to environmental damage, I think is, one step that I could take. I mean, it's a privately owned firm, so, the shareholder activism and in terms of responsibility, is a little bit less, but I think that maybe looking for, looking towards these sustainable and environmentally friendly solutions in building buildings would be one step. In terms of what do I think the younger generation needs in order to, be able to recognize some of the problems and address them, I would say really it's education. Excuse me, I'm sorry. People need to be more informed, especially our generation. We're doing, like Jack said, we have this 100-page paper on pretty much how the K through 12 education system is failing us. There aren't enough 18-year-olds that are ready to go into a career or go to college. And we're using different metrics like ACT scores and SAT scores to see how many kids are actually college and career ready. And I think it's 33% for ACT and 42% for SAT. So kids aren't ready. And I think that not only based on how that raises inequality and contributes to low social mobility and weakens our international competitiveness, I think that more importantly, it's on the kids to care more, and to want to address these issues. Yes, there needs to be an intergenerational conversation. Yes, there are people in positions of power and corporations that, as of right now, are, the first step in making it and lasting change. But it's going to have to fall on our generation to straighten out Social Security, straighten out entitlements, and we need to be informed to do that. So, the only reason I mentioned all those test scores and indicators is that we're not getting any smarter over time. And I just want to stress on the fact that our students need to be more educated and more ready to enter into the real world to actually make a difference rather than try and, get by with the system that's in place.
Yeah, I sort of have a different take. I guess one of the most defining consequences I think of the kind of rise of neoliberalism and the sort of dominance of just pursuing wealth is that it becomes very individualistic, and as a consequence, it's very difficult to find commonality, to build coalitions, to have solidarity in the working class and elsewhere. And so I think retaining a sort of conscious empathy is really important, especially as we pursue our careers and are often consumed by those careers. And so I think, for example, if I, right now, I'm interested in public policy and I'm interested in different areas of concern, like payday loans, for example, because payday loans are really problematic because if a poor person runs into an unexpected expense, they often can't rely on someone else to cover the payment. And so in order to, pay the bill to avoid extra fees, payday loan is oftentimes the only option left. But the regulation of payday loans can be extremely problematic if those loan operators are allowed to charge extremely high interest rates and accrue higher fees after. And so effectively they're just kind of bottom feeding on the most vulnerable members of society, and without really strict regulation of those companies, it can be extremely corrosive to society, not just economically. And so I think what I hope to do is to sort of try to retain that empathy over time as I grow, so that I can continue to be engaged in these issues as I have been at Williams as the rules change. And so I think just really trying to retain a sense of commonality that is really difficult today.
So I'm not sure, should all three of us address each question?
Probably not, but go ahead on this one. And then I'm gonna ask Rick to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly, the last bit you said was kind of what can be done to make sure that most people are kind of entering the world acting the right way. And I think that's kind of the role of rules change in a way, and journalism and media more generally. One thing that Bill pointed out to me and kind of changed my perspective a little bit was about Occupy Wall Street. They were kind of portrayed negatively by a lot of media and kind of were seen as a movement that didn't really have a deliverable, they didn't have a cause they exactly wanted. But they were pointing to a real problem, and it really made it a national problem that that people weren't really necessarily aware of before, the whole 1%, 99% thing, they totally put on the map. So just through rules change and similar organizations, just highlighting all of the possible solutions there are out there is really an important way to combat the whole, I'm just a cog in the system, let me throw my hands up, there's nothing to be done. So that was my take.
Rick?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say I was really impressed with what Tom and Jack and Mitch had to say, and from their personal experiences. I thought there were a number of things that came up. Thinking about what Jack, if I've got it right, said when you were rattling off, and I didn't get the name of the chain of restaurants, but you mentioned Patagonia and a chain of restaurants and some cooperative firms that were really operating in a kind of a stakeholder capitalism, an inclusive capitalism way. They were models of better business than the prevailing model. One of the questions I have is whether or not there's much information available out to the public, and particularly to your generation, about this kind of thing. I mentioned the contrast between Cisco and Walmart, which is there in front of, and it's some of those ship their profitable. I wonder whether or not, your generation would benefit by having a bunch of guys like you sit down and say, can we identify 25? Can we identify 100 good companies, and particularly companies that are producing products that they're buying, whether they're, actually, I think there's a firm that produces sunglasses, and I'm not quite sure which one it is, which is run in a very responsible way, and another one, competitor ranked side by side that's not. I wonder if you guys, or people like you, particularly you guys, since you've gotten involved with Routine, could actually compile that list and share it. Or can you go on the internet and can you find that there are people in the millennial generation on social media because consumer power is very important. I mean, the Market Basket thing turned around in part because shoppers stopped shopping at Market Basket because the people who were after high profits and low wages fired the CEO, believed in higher wages and sharing them. They had to turn the thing off. Had to turn over the company back to the other guy. He bought them out. I'm just wondering whether or not there's number one, there's a way you can do that. That's kind of for you, Jack, whether or not you follow that Mitch. I mean, if you're going to go into banking, it isn't just payday loans. Banks and financial industries make their most money off the people who are least able to pay off their debts. And so what they do is they push debts on people that they know can't pay them off because they constantly are getting late fees and overdraft fees, and they're constantly having to reflow. I mean, it's a business model that is actually, it's a kind of a vulture business model. I mean, they're going after the easy prey, and people that can pay off their debts and pay off their credit cards, sure, they'll take them, but they don't really put their emphasis on that. They're constantly giving credit, where people can't afford it. I don't know if you noticed, New York Times this week reported that Wells Fargo is going to stop floating so many subprime auto loans because there were people getting sucked into these loans who had no chance in the world of paying off the loans, and they were winding up by possessing their cars, which was the... I mean, what about the rest? So if you guys enter the financial arena, you're headed for Wall Street, you got those issues right in front of you. I'm just wondering, Mitch, the question to you, what you can do about it. Not just as payday loans that somebody's doing on the street corner beside the 7-Eleven, but what the bank is actually doing in the inner city where you're going to go.
Yeah, so I guess I should provide a little information. I'm not working at a payday loan operator, although, yeah. So I'm working in a coverage group, which means that we advise our clients on whatever they want to do, raise debt, raise equity, buy a company, etc. So I don't actually figure out how much debt the company should take on or things like that. So I guess I'm in a more consulting type advisory role, but I definitely will keep my eyes out for borrowers who shouldn't be borrowing as much as they want to, because that's a bad thing.
I think going off that point too, Hedrick, where you're talking about these loans that people can't pay back, it just reminded me of student loans as well. and the progression of student loans, where you'd have universities that could either get a direct or guaranteed loan from the government. So these guaranteed loans were done, which completely 100% backs government's payment of student loans. So what happens with these guaranteed loans is they're getting money from the government to pay for these kids' student loans, and I think the interest rate's about 1 or 2%. I'm sorry, that's for the direct loans, directly from the government, 1 or 2%. But then with these guaranteed loans, they know that the money is still coming from the government, but then organizations like Sallie Mae can charge a 7-8% interest rate, even though if the student defaults on the loan, they only have to pay 2%, the government still pays 98%. So like you said, it's multiple entities and institutions that are, kind of picking on people that can't support themselves, and people continually fall into these traps. And there are still, we wrote the paper on student loans, and there are still people today that are 85 years old still paying off student loans because they had, because the institution that they had, or Sallie Mae, charged them 70% interest rate on a loan that they only paid 1% of when it defaulted. So there is a lot of corruption, and it is something that needs to be addressed.
Question?
Jack, I got to hear from Jack about the idea of putting together a list of companies that are good behaviors and passing the word out to the millennial generation. You were on there. Talk.
Yeah. So actually, I would say that the level of awareness of companies doing things like that is very low. I learned of benefit corporations for the first time in rules change, which is a little embarrassing to say, but the whole B Corp movement is a really interesting thing to learn about. And I spoke with a number of really interesting people that were directly involved with this. Margaret Kelly started, oh man, I can't remember the name of the magazine, but it was a magazine that had an annual compilation of the 100 best corporate citizens that was annually put together. And I think it's really important that that movement does exist and that businesses take responsibility for what they're doing. I think the Milton Friedman quote that you mentioned earlier, that a business's only responsibility is to get the highest returns as possible, the most profit as possible is the only moral responsibility. I think that is the prevalent view among not only my generation, but most people, that businesses should and will only act out of their best self-interest. So yeah, I think it's important to have a lot of awareness about corporations who are doing things differently. Like the few that I mentioned are just a drop in the bucket, but it's an important movement and it's one that people don't know much about.
You might be comforted to know that the Conference Board, which is an organization of some of the largest corporations in America, is regularly holding seminars on how to get their own corporate leaders to think more long-term. Because when people talk about maximum return to shareholders, they almost always mean in the next quarter or in this year. And what responsible business leaders of major companies are worried about is that everybody is suffering from short-termism in the long term. I mean, I gave you those numbers. 91% of the money, the profit that these major corporations are getting are going to shareholders, and only 9% going to growth. I mean, that's eating your seed corn. And people at very high levels in American business are starting to worry about it. And they're starting to worry about whether or not we're going to be a competitive economy, by the time you guys are 30 or 40, in the way that we have been in the past. And this is a big practical problem. It's not just profits versus being nice. It is short-term profits as opposed to even longer-term growth in profits where everybody would profit more. So it's not just money against something that's socially nice. It is smart money versus.
Aren't we also, though, talking about changing the way we think about each other, changing the way we behave with each other, and therefore changing the way we govern the organizational structure that we've chosen to have, which is a standard C Corp. I'm wondering whether the three of you, perceive any change just in the 4 years you've been at Williams in people's perception of what their behavior ought to be like in the rest of their life, in relation to work and cultural values and government and corporations? Maybe yes, maybe no, I'm just curious.
I think it does. I think Williams does a good job of that. I think it's a problem on a national level because we're talking about these macroeconomic national problems. And so you, as any one individual living within that system, it's hard to conceptualize, you know, an impoverished person in New Mexico coming from a middle-class person in Nebraska, coming from a high-class person in New York, you know. So there's such a broad array, and the fact that these are federal policy issues, it makes it hard to kind of think of your behavior with another as being a part of this problem whatsoever. So I think Williams does do a good job of making you think more along those lines. But I think given, you know, the federal format of our country, it's kind of hard to keep in the fore of your mind.
Yeah, echoing off that, I think Williams does a great job of teaching you to respect people from all different backgrounds. So just on a purely personable, human level, I think Williams does a great job of helping people grow and helping people be more accepting of people from different backgrounds and people that share different viewpoints and ideologies from you. And also, obviously, due to the academic rigor, it teaches you how to be hardworking, how to manage your time, how to take constructive criticism, which I think will pay dividends for graduates in the workforce that they choose to go into. I don't know necessarily if Williams does a good job promoting or perpetuating people's need for accountability in institutions or firms that they're going into. You know, I know that students graduating from Williams have good ethics and a good value system. But I don't know if necessarily everyone also has high aspirations and high goals for themselves. So I don't know how much of that would be sacrificed in order to make sure the company was being done the right way. I would like to think that Williams students in the firm that they went into would, you know, be open and accepting and respectful of all their colleagues and also be a hardworking contributor to the firm. I'm just not sure if people are actively going into their work environment looking to, you know, right any wrongs that are in the current system that they're placed in.
Yeah, I would agree with what's been said in terms of the shortage of, you know, options in between. For example, like, to me, it's almost like, oh, you need to go sort of like capitalize on all the investment that's been put into you by your parents in giving you this education. You need to, you know, show that it's valuable by getting a good job. And getting a job for starters. And then on the other side, you know, people could say, oh, you know, this education has been so great, I've been so fortunate, now I'm going to start giving back right now, right after graduation, and go work at, you know, some nonprofit organization. But I think it would be so compelling to have some middle ground option, like a successful B corporation, to say, look, you can get both a reasonable salary and you can also make a positive contribution to society. And to me, that's just not out there. Well, now we know that it's out there from rules change, but in terms of like the career center, advertising options like that, or even having it on the menu, is I think a serious problem.
Interesting. So at the beginning of this evening, I asked if you could think a little bit about two questions. One was, what does the American dream mean to you? How would you achieve it? How would you maintain an economic system that makes it available to all? And the other question I asked you was, what does making a difference mean to you, or has it meant to you in your life? And what can we do with Congress and corporations to make it easier for you to make a difference? Now, those are just, what I really love is for you all to address questions to these three gentlemen and to Rick Smith, and it doesn't have to be anything to do with either of those things. I just wanted to get some creative juices flowing. I moved the camera down here because just in order to have Rick feel part of the conversation. If you don't mind getting up and coming up here, that would be great. On the other hand, it's a small enough group that I think you can probably just sit where you are and address the question to these three guys. So I'm going to ask if anybody wants to take the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for you coming out of college. Before I came here, my dad is a Williams guy. I am not. I spent over 30 years in New York City. What do you propose to do about these unions? The teachers' unions are corrupting education. I mean, kids don't have a fair shot. What do you do to take the power away from these unions? Or how do you engage them in a dialogue? Because they're fighting the charter school system. Kids are not having an opportunity. I did some freelance work at the Board of Ed. And you know, you have teachers sitting in a rubber room? What is that all about? And then they do the bare minimum because this is the union way and you don't have to do any more. And I just see it because that's what I see in New York City. I'm not saying all unions are bad or all teachers' unions, but I just feel like there's a big problem in New York City. And it's not being fair to, you know, everybody who deserves a good education.
Yeah, so like I said, we're working on a project now. We are not supposed to presuppose a policy, so I can't say that ours will be to deal with the unions directly. But what I will say is that, I mean, education is hard. It's been a great experiment in this country for decades now. And some of the research we've done already has found, you know, there was a really big preliminary push to smaller class sizes as the panacea. It was everyone, we just need to get these class sizes smaller, get kids individual attention, and that's going to solve the problem. But what was found in a lot of cases was that led to lowering the quality of teacher that was hired, and just filling in all these more roles and less qualified teachers, and it actually, in a lot of cases, ended up being a detriment. And furthermore, they found that teacher salaries in a lot of countries and prestige, that determines who becomes a teacher. So like in Finland, for instance, that's kind of one of the most prestigious jobs. Every teacher is in the top 10% of their graduating college class. They all know 2 languages. They all have some special skill. It's impossible to become a teacher. So, I mean, that's one possible solution, is just changing the entire way we think about teachers, is because, you know, it's important to have teachers that want to be teachers and have high salaries, and we're getting the right people funneled into that system. But as it is now, I agree with you that the unions can kind of be counterproductive, and they're just fighting for rights without actually trying to, without, the benefit for them is fighting for their own rights versus fixing the education system. So it's kind of a distorted incentive structure.
Exactly. I think exactly echoing what Jack said. Teacher quality seems to be the biggest indicator of student success. So that's why it kind of leaves a tough situation for the unions, because you want, you know, teachers to be able to pay a good enough salary in order to take that job and actually care about the students. But I agree with you that the unions have become a manipulative force. Governor Chris Christie and I agree. I think that we should maybe get rid of tenure, or, you know, look to restructuring tenure, because a lot of problem arises at a teacher getting tenure after 2-3 years and the quality of their instruction just declines rapidly, but their pay doesn't. And it's tremendously costly to try and remove a teacher after they've acquired tenure. Millions of dollars it takes for, you know, I think there was a lawsuit in California. I think there were 7 teachers that were reported consistently for poor teacher quality that had tenure, and the lawsuit turned out to be like $15 million for the state of California. So I think that if there was some way to reevaluate and reassess during different periods of time, that would maybe help give less power to the unions, or at least make sure the right people are in those unions.
Other questions?
Yeah. And I think it was Mitch that mentioned it earlier, but talking about sort of payday loans, and I mean, I guess I'm wondering there is either way, with or without payday loans, there's this huge market for people that need money, and I mean, if the banking system and kind of what's in place there isn't working well, what do you suggest?
Well, I think it's important to view the issue of payday loans sort of like holistically and in relation to the other policies that are actually like causing these problems to begin with. So I guess, you know, for like, it's impossible to just focus on how payday loan places operate in order to resolve the problem, meaning that you need to understand what's causing the struggle before, and that's where that's where the conversation pivots to talking about something like pre-K childhood education, because it is, you know, one of the most it's one of the most powerful drivers of upward economic mobility. And so I agree with you that there will always be people who are willing to take high interest loans who probably shouldn't, and that you would hope that that person can rely either on a friend, family member, or the government in order to get themselves back up. And the important thing that I think about payday loans is that, like, if you think about the way the government structures student loan repayment now, they do a sort of like pay as you earn system, where you only pay a portion of your income, and it's restricted, and then that sort of thing doesn't exist for payday loans. So in that situation, let's say you take out a loan and then the next month you have all your earnings, and the payday loan, you need to pay like all of it, right? Because there's no cap on how much you should pay. So if that was changed, or if the student loan option was in place, you would have a restriction on the amount you would pay. So obviously you can't implement that for a payday loan lender, because they wouldn't be profitable if they were only taking 10% of a small portion of income, especially as that income might dry out or be interrupted. So it's a really tricky issue, payday loans, and I don't have any convenient answers, but I do think it's important, especially when you're thinking about unexpected expenses among some of the most impoverished people, that you really need to consider other policy decisions in other institutions that are also at work to support those people.
And I would just quickly add to that, I mean, that should be where
I
entrepreneurship
heard
comes
Chris
in.
exactly right, if I can join in. There are a bunch of ideas about student debt, but Elizabeth Warren has proposed that students should be charged the same rate of interest that Wall Street banks are charged. Students are now charged about 50 times as much as Wall Street banks. So that would have an enormous impact. The private universities, the for-profit universities that are set up are racking up enormous amounts of federal money. They pull in about $32 billion a year. The graduation rates are about, in the case of Phoenix University, which is the largest and most famous, graduation rate is 15%. So, I mean, something needs to be done to connect the granting of loans to students to go to an institution is basically not delivering them what they promised. So, I mean, you can start there. You've got proposals not just from President Obama, but in Tennessee, Utah, Oregon, Texas for free tuition for the first 2 years of community college to try to get the kids started. But we've got another huge problem which you haven't addressed. We have 6 million disadvantaged youth in America, and by that they mean kids between 16 and 24 who are neither working nor in school. And a huge percentage of them, something like a third to 40% of them, have finished high school, but they're not job ready because they don't have the soft skills, what are called the soft skills. Show up at work on time, be reliable, be able to take criticism, dress right, talk to people right. These are not academic skills. There are organizations now that work on that. I mean, even believe it or not, Starbucks is involved with it. JP Morgan Chase is involved. So people are starting to recognize that there are things that can be done by different parts of the private sector working with the government to confront these problems directly. The answer is we got to get moving. We got to get engaged and not just stand back and sort of regard these as an academic discussion. But what can we do wherever we're sitting in our society to begin to tackle these problems? And I thought the comments that were made by Tom at the beginning about what he could do in the construction firm that he's figuring on going into, or maybe you're already there as an intern. I thought those are very constructive, Tom. What can I do in the environment I'm going into? And not just, what the heck can they do far away to deal with this as a national problem? We do need to deal with that, but a lot of us can do something about it somewhere in the environment right around ourselves.
Other questions? Yeah.
There's a lot that's been said about the problems with corporations, misaligned incentives, tremendously high pay to the CEOs, poor pay to others. The corporations have boards of directors that supposedly are representing the shareholders. In fact, I think for the most part, the boards of directors are representing themselves. One person was on the board of another company, and that other company, they have interlocking boards. People that own stock in the corporation are given voting rights. I've never seen any kind of a program that was available to educate shareholders about how What are their interests? What kinds of things can they accomplish by getting together? And how do you read these documents? I think that could be a tremendously informative and important process. There are somebody, there are some large shareholders, public investment funds in California, for example, and these companies will sometimes take positions opposed to the board. But that doesn't happen very often, and even when it happens, they don't necessarily get support of the other shareholders, because I think people aren't informed, people aren't educated. I can see some sort of a non-profit body educating these people, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with a lot of what you said, and I think it's really important. I think I would just note the problem is especially serious for the U.S. because we have such dispersed share ownership here, meaning that as a large number of individual shareholders only own a small amount, so therefore we have a collective action problem to get to have all of us say, okay, let's get together and go talk to the corporation, tell them what to do. So now that you're in that position, you're left with, like you were saying, controlling shareholders who are often, not constructed in a way that they're going to allocate a lot of resources to try and think about how the company should grow. That being said, there's currently this sort of debate going on about, there's a lot of people in Harvard, Lucian Bemchak is one name that I think is really a sort of a thought leader in this area, and they're basically arguing that the actual corporate governance structure of a company should be in the hands of the shareholders, meaning that the whole reason corporate governance mechanisms exist, like the way directors are elected, what directors are elected, and all those processes, they shouldn't really be in control of board members themselves, because the very existence of corporate governance is to make board members actually hold the CEO accountable. So if board members and the CEO are in control of the rules of the game, then they're probably going to keep the rules of the game in place, and that's what we've seen. And so the argument is that we should let shareholders have a say, because if the CEO is continuing to pay himself tons of money, take loans from the company, and just continue all this egregious behavior as it's sanctioned by the board, then we're going to continue to see more of what we have, and what we have is not good. And so I personally I'm a supporter of this idea, but I know it's very controversial, and it's sort of people will say, oh, you're about to upend 100 years of corporate law by sort of changing the relationship between directors and boards. But I think it's really important, especially to just bring this issue, which is hard to talk about because it's sort of like dry for some people. And I think it really can be interesting and is very compelling to think about how boards operate in relation to CEOs and shareholders.
All I'm trying to suggesting is it's one thing to change the law as to what the rights of shareholders are. That's a largely a political process. But what I'm talking about is working within the existing process, but educating shareholders, educating them as to what they can do, what they can accomplish, what they ought to be looking for. And I think then if you get a few activists in a particular company, and they get access to getting proposals for the annual meeting, then people can be educated to understand whether they should back these kinds of things. Because normally, unless
You've got a great idea, and it's going on. You have great ideas going on. There are organizations that are focused on individual companies, and there are organizations that are focused across the board. There's an organization called the Library, where you can go and actually get all kinds of information about what shareholders can do in a variety of companies. You can go, if you look at shareholder organizations or shareholder education organizations on the internet, you will find several of them, they're active doing it. Part of the problem is that the rules set by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, tend to favor management. Most of the votes that stockholders who theoretically own and run the company, when they succeed, they are called advisory to the board of directors. They don't have the power of law. They don't have the power of force. It's crazy. We operate, even people who advocate shareholder capitalism don't actually want to give shareholders the power. And they've actually testified in front of Congress and congressional committees and openly said that. A corporation is not a democracy, was what the head of the Business Roundtable testified at the time of the Dodd-Frank legislation in 2009, 2010. And that was the most direct statement about it, but it happens again and again. There are people working on this. You raised a really good question. You should get engaged on this if they're particular companies. If you're interested in Walmart, if you're interested in JP Morgan, almost every one of those major corporations has a shareholder battle going on at every annual meeting on some issue, dealing with corporate governance, dealing with executive pay, but the most popular issue at shareholder meetings in American corporations today is a demand from shareholders that company management disclose how they're spending money in political campaigns. The most common shareholder resolution in American corporate annual meetings is the demand that corporations be open about their political spending, and there are very few of those that have carried. However, issue has caused management in a number of American corporations, I believe the number is well over 100 now, to voluntarily decide to disclose that information. My point is shareholder pressure can work even though it doesn't have the power of law.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that is sort of the like social-minded activists you could think of, even individual investors made tremendous strides during apartheid in terms of convincing the companies that had operations there to discontinue those operations, and that was sort of like a social activist approach in the context of individual corporations. So there was no change to federal law. There was merely like a democratic pressure placed on those companies and forced to change. So it has been going on, and I think it definitely, hopefully, will continue.
Yeah.
On a larger scale, do you see any lessons from the recent win on net neutrality? Any lessons from that? Maybe Rick has some? That's a larger scale response from the public that surprised some people. Any diagnosis or?
I'm sorry, I can't understand the question.
Oh, sorry, I was just asking
I mean, it's this audio, it's not what you said, the audio is just.
No, I was just asking about the internet neutrality fight.
Yeah, Paula Consolini's question is,
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Why do
There's
you
no
listen?
question that public pressure had an impact on the policy decision that was made. And one of the arguments that was being made was that average consumers basically had no choice in their internet supplier in their area. They either got Comcast or they got somebody else. They didn't have much choice. The suppliers, the IP people, they wanted a much more relaxed system of control. I don't think there's any, the president spoke out, but there was also a lot of public pressure on this. And there was a fight within the business community. The business community was not united. Silicon Valley electronic high-tech firms, they wanted communications commissions adopted. But so did many people representing the Consumer Federation of America, ordinary consumers. Yeah, it had an impact. That was very important. I mean, the argument I'm trying to make here is that engagement does pay off. It doesn't mean immediate victories. It doesn't mean you're going to win every time. But getting involved is really important. People have tended to go passive and say, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all controlled by powerful, rich lobbies in Washington. And it is. We can have an impact.
I'd also add that what was unique about that campaign is it was very heavily managed by internet emails and connectivity over the internet with the FCC. And I think that that's an example of how the change, one way in which the new technology world we're in actually makes it possible to get aggregated consumer action around an issue. But you guys have anything to add?
Oh, we're excited about it. We're glad for the results.
And in that sense, that's my take too, that it is, there's a change here. And before it was just letters and calls and the like,
Right.
those are still valuable in Congress, but this idea that now there's this opportunity, and it seems there are a number of groups that are kind of heroes in this, to help people, to help get the word out. They took that sustained effort from small groups as well as large, representing the public, as well as the businesses that had a more enlightened self-interest, a sort of a communitarian perspective in this, that aligned with their own interests. So it was encouraging, sure.
Cindy, what have you been thinking tonight? I'm going to put you on the spot. You got anything?
My mind has not stopped. It's just, everything. I think of my dad. When when Rick spoke about the period in time from 1940 to 1970.
Right. The growth of a small family business did really well.
My
Put some
dad
kids,
and mom
right.
cooked hamburgers, and their middle-class family in Williamstown. They sent both kids to college with cash. They went to Europe every year. They worked half the year. And I did the same thing, and, I'm on fuel assistance.
Yeah. Things have changed a little bit. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask you somewhat of a personal question, but beginning with the question of how each of you would go about calculating what ought to be the minimum wage. And then what each of you, and I have to tell you that I was a management school professor, and I used to have this conversation with my own students back then. How each of you would calculate what you believe you ought to be paid going now out into the world as newly minted college graduates, what you see yourself as potentially earning 10 years from now and 20 years from now to live the kind of lives that you think you're entitled to live. And you can take inflation out of that, so you do it in terms of constant dollars. What you see yourselves bringing to the equation, bringing to the American dream in return for those salaries that you anticipate earning.
Well, just to field the first part of your question, minimum wage, I think there should be some kind of living standard that is reasonably adapted at a federal level that can then just be pegged. But the fact that inflation isn't pegged, or that the minimum wage isn't already pegged to inflation is pretty ridiculous in and of itself. So the fact that states have to go out and individually raise their rates, and even just in cities, that's a problem. And I think at least pegging it to inflation is the first step, but there needs to be also a broader conversation about living standards. And to answer the second part of your question, it's hard for me to say what I expect to earn, but what I will say is that it's become, in my research, surprising and a bit depressing of how much you do have to earn these days to achieve a certain standard that wasn't the case 10, 20, 30 years ago. I keep going back to our education research, just that's what we're working on now. Looking along income lines, even in families where the parents have an income of like 100 to 150,000, those students are having really poor academic and lifetime results. Like, it's really the upper ends where things are still okay. So things do need to change, and I think you need to make a lot more today than you used to have the same standard of living.
I guess in terms of what I would contribute to earn my salary, I would just say to bring values back, and to really just harp on personal relationships and building those relationships over time, and treating people the right way, and having the right values and decorum, and carrying myself the right way, and hopefully that rubs off on other people in the company that I'm working for. In terms of an exact salary, I'm really happy to have a job, first and foremost, but I guess looking down the road, I hope to, first I'm not a construction management major here, so I interned last summer at this firm, and it was completely new, just language of construction management, how to build buildings, how to get materials, whether it be on the ground or in the office, or, communicating with the acquisition firm who you're working for. So I'm just hoping to, learn about the industry, put in hard work that's needed, and most importantly, build good relationships over time. And then hopefully in 10 years, Boston, America does get the Olympic bid, and I've made good connections and put in hard volunteer work in the Boston 2024 committee, and then I'm in a position at Suffolk where maybe Suffolk gets the bid for to build some of the stadiums for the 2024 Olympics. And I think that goes back to Rick's point too, in terms of what can I do at my firm. I talked about lead, but also I think it's important to address community. And if Boston were to get the 2024 bid, there wouldn't just be stadiums in Boston. There'd be one in Springfield. There'd be one in Lower New Hampshire. So it's about kind of igniting and fueling all of New England around a common cause, not only creating jobs, but hopefully instilling some sort of national pride in the Olympics and in that area specifically. So I just hope to keep my head on straight, stay clear-eyed, and hopefully form good relationships with people that pay dividends for me later on.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and challenging question, both because behind the backdrop of what would be ideally what the minimum wage should be is what would the macroeconomic consequences be, if we raise the minimum wage to 20 in every state. There might be some real harm in some places, however in other places it might be spectacular. And so given those considerations, I would still say we should raise the minimum wage, that's a pretty easy thing to say, but actually carrying it out is much more difficult. I think the measurements of poverty are also a serious problem in terms of how it's calculated and how sort of static that figure is. And so pivoting a little bit to what do I hope to bring, I guess I hope to, one of the reasons why I got interested in the financial crisis was because I kept coming up over these accounts where I kept coming over the situations where someone was asked to take a risk that they were uncomfortable taking, and then they were fired if they weren't willing to take that risk, or they voluntarily left after they realized that the culture wouldn't change. And so, so I guess one of the things that I really am going to keep close to home is the idea that I have to retain a conscientious awareness of what's going on, not just what I'm doing, but what others are doing around me. Because I think in order to foster your own sort of reputation, you have to hold yourself and others accountable, and I think it's especially important to do so in a large organization. And I think it's especially hard to do that when you're the lowest person on the ladder, to sort of watch what the people above you are doing. But I think it's tremendously important, and if you look at the firms that did well or were able to recover well from the financial crisis, they were the people that started to take a hard look at what the businesses that they were running, the products that they were selling, and really asking, is this a good product, and is this the right match? And so really trying to take on those questions with a degree of sincerity is pretty important, and that's what I hope to do. I think the other issue is 10 years down the road, I don't know what I'm going to be doing, but I think where I'm starting will give me a good, even just having Williams under my belt is I'm so fortunate to be able to go out into the business world and have a job already. So I think, after 2 years I could be, or 3, 4, whatever. It's hard to say where I'll be.
I think I remember there was one other question. Oh, there's a couple of questions. And Rick, do you have anything? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nobody's figured out a way to calculate an absolute minimum wage, but it seems to me a minimum wage ought to lift you above the poverty level. And if the federal minimum wage now is $7.25 an hour, anybody who's making that full-time, working full-time all year long, qualifies for food stamps, for Medicaid, for all kinds of poverty programs. So it's one of the basic ideas is just simply to lift it. out of the poverty level. The second thing to say is that the minimum wage today, adjusted for inflation, is 33% below where it was in 1968. So we've gone backwards an enormous distance on minimum wage. If you go back to the period that I was talking about before, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the minimum wage was regularly raised at that point so that it stayed about 45%, almost 43, 46, 45% of the average wage, the median wage all over the country. Okay, so there was a ratio between what average people were making, what the people at the bottom were making. So, you know, those are things that you can triangulate, but there's no absolute economic formula for that. You know that as a management professor, but at least we have some historical guidelines that we could go back and refer to. In Seattle, when they went to the $15 minimum wage, their belief in Seattle was that would boost the economy, that by putting that wage level, $15 an hour, which they were going to do gradually over a period of 4 or 5 years. It wasn't going to happen with a snap of fingers. They would actually increase the purchasing power of about 100,000 workers in Seattle every year. And the Seattle economy, and it would drive the Seattle economy and actually improve the economy. And there's some evidence in states that are side by side that have different minimum wages, that the ones with the higher minimum wage actually do better economically than the ones with the lower minimum wage. In fact, we have a couple of cities, I think, Indiana, where you can actually see that happening. So there are a whole bunch of factors that need to be brought into account, but we're way out of whack today compared to where we've been historically, and certainly we're out of whack in terms of people making the minimum wage and then turning around and qualifying for poverty programs. That's crazy. We're subsidizing employers who are paying.
Go ahead, audience.
Hi, so I was wondering if you guys can name maybe a particular law which should be passed or a rule which should be changed, which would be important for helping us reclaim the American dream.
Campaign finance spending.
How public education is funded on the county level.
I would say student loans in terms of the lightening the repayment burden. And another thing I would add is the use of private student loans. So I think one rule that should be changed is before any borrower takes out a private loan, I think they should have to fully exhaust the federal loan options, because those federal loan options, they're not only cheaper than the private loans, but they're also structured in a way to alleviate the student loan burden afterwards. And so if someone is taking more private student loans than they need, they're effectively hurting themselves just because of a lack of information. And so I don't think private student lenders should be able to benefit from that information asymmetry between borrowers and lenders.
Cindy, you had another question?
If we have time, I wanted to ask Tom a question about the company you work for. Did you say it was Suffolk?
Correct.
How does a company, who does a company like that give its bid to bid on the Olympic Stadium? Who pays?
So it's a little bit of a conflict of interest here. So it's who would be funding the Boston 2024?
Yes.
It would be some partially from the state governments, and I think some of it, controversially, is from the CEO of Suffolk Construction, is also the chairman of the Boston 2024 Olympic bid. So we catch a little grief because Suffolk already has about 60% of all the commercial work in Boston, and now he's the chairman for the bid to build all these Olympic stadiums. But it would come from like state municipals, and I'm not exactly sure if anybody on the board or any of the executive directors would be coming out of their pocket directly. I would assume it would be from state and government funding.
What happens to these buildings?
Afterwards,
what's going on after this building?
Springfield's getting an MGM Grand Studio. Maybe if there's a stadium there, they could move, a sports team or UMass or someone.
Do they utilize them afterwards? The Olympic?
I would think, what was the last one? We had one in Salt Lake City, that there are facilities that are still used, and what else was there? Lake Placid. I think that's one of the challenges they're facing, you know, this is a tremendously expensive and costly endeavor to undertake, so I'm sure they're taking strides to ensure that these facilities would be used after the fact, and it wouldn't just be a sunk cost, and they could actually contribute to the local communities and New England as a whole.
We should start to wrap up, because it's 5 minutes of 9, and there's a lot of snow out there, but is there anybody who has got one last quick question, and then we'll start to close out here? Yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to say, I'm a Williams senior, and I mean, I guess just to you guys, since you've started working on rules change, I mean, have there been any big changes that you've noticed in your personal life from gaining all this experience? I mean, has it affected you personally? I know you've talked about kind of how you're going to behave differently in the future in your careers, but...
Yeah, I'd say exactly what you said. Perspective is the main thing that I gained, you know, realizing that this isn't just, we've studied a lot of these issues, healthcare, immigration, education in the classroom setting, which is, you know, definitely useful and has definitely broadened, you know, my experience, but being actually in the real world, trying to deal with these things on a grassroots level, it brings a lot more reality to the situation, especially as we're about to graduate, and this is going to be our responsibility in the next coming years.
Yeah, I guess for me it's sort of by taking all of these policy questions that we've been thinking about in an academic setting and moving it towards a journalist setting means that you need to make them more compelling and interesting to read and like have a higher salience. And so because of this reframing, I think I've become more inclined to like even talk about some of the issues that we've been looking at in rules change with our friends. I think we've even done that together.
With you four.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for that.
And so I think by doing that, we're carrying out like the rules change mission just on our own because we're trying to. Yeah.
Come
on, they should be in public policy.
And that's, you know, I see here we have little reflections from each of us.
If you've got a quick one, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just want to first of all thank all you guys for coming out here. I know the weather was bad. I wish we had a little bit better of a student turnout because, like I've been echoing throughout this whole time, it takes passionate students that are going to be able to make meaningful change. I also want to thank Dr. Consolini for setting me up with this opportunity. I was kind of straggling last minute to find something for winter study, and this was just such a great experience, so I want to thank you for that. And then finally, I want to thank you, Bill, for being such an inspiring individual. I really enjoyed, you know, the experience we had, and I think that your determination, especially in the fact that, you know, rules change is still at its inception, and it's not gaining that much traction as quickly as you want, but you're still so dedicated and focused on it. I think that that's, you know, really inspiring. So I hope that there could be some sort of pipeline set up between the Center for Learning and Action and through the Political Economy Department where you could have students that are passionate about these issues help you gain traction and keep this thing going in the right direction.
Yes.
Again, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for Dr. Consolini and Bill and Rick for joining us. I guess I'd say just the main takeaway from rules change is I really had a change of perspective. I can see I went from someone who's looking at these stats and seeing it on the news and saying, oh, that's a shame, to totally changing the perspective to that's something that I could actually be active in inspiring change in. So that change in mentality, I think, was really important, and I'm glad it happened now when it did.
Yeah, just thank you to Bill and Rick and everyone who would have repeated it by now, and the audience, of course, last but not least. I just think that like civic engagement is something that you don't really think of as being very lively right now in our culture. Like if you even just think about like the state of like how people identify as Americans, right? You know, you don't want to identify as an American just because of some of the things that our country's done lately. But I think that can, by taking responsibility for, you know, yourself and for your country, you can be a little bit more civic-minded and be a little bit more confident in what is possible. So I appreciate what I got from rules change in that perspective shift.
Thanks, guys. Rick, got anything?
Well, I was impressed with how much the students got from working with you, and number one, and number two, I'm impressed with how tenacious the audience has been and stuck with us this long. Obviously, it's a small group of people, but very interested, and that's very heartwarming. Thank you all.
Thanks to all of you for coming out, and Rick, thanks for joining us, and please send a little warm weather up here from Washington. Appreciate that.
Please.
It's headed your way.
Okay, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, guys.